And now we will be joined by the members of the prosecution for today's proceedings. Mr. Robert Meyer Burnett, thank you for joining us today.
It's an important issue to be discussing, and I'm happy to be here. The cultural vandalism that has been shown by the Disney Corporation cannot stand, and I'm here to hopefully defend imagination connoisseurs the world over.
Thank you for your presence today. You, Mr. Burnett, are up. You're up first. Mr. Ng is here to support on the prosecution. Mr. Burnett on the charge of fraudulent misuse of canon. Please present your argument.
Well, first of all, one of the things that Disney did when they purchased LUCASFILM, and I would like to point out, first of all, that George Lucas bought, he was paid by Disney for just over $4 billion for the franchise. He was paid $2.21 billion in cash by Disney, and he was also paid 37,076,679 shares of Disney stock. If you just round that down to 37 million, today the Disney stock price means that George Lucas was actually paid $5,404 million. So George Lucas has made an extra $1.4 billion on the deal, which means Disney continues to pay George Lucas in his stock dividends and money. I would like that to go on the record, please, as showing that Mr. Lucas is continuing to handsomely benefit from Disney's payment of Star Wars. And I would like to say also for the record that if you ever paid $5.4 billion for something, I would think that being the custodian of whatever it is that you paid for would be of the utmost importance to you, to make sure the value of something you paid that much money for was protected at all costs. Unfortunately, I don't see that as the case, and Disney shareholders should be very aware of that. Anyway, one of the very first things that Disney did when they took over Star Wars is they eliminated the expanded universe. And the expanded universe, according to Lucasfilm, was considered canon. The books were considered canon up to the point that Disney took possession of them. For instance, Cobb Vanth, while actually he was in a novel that was published by Disney, even Disney couldn't keep it straight. In the Aftermath novels, Cobb Vanth's history backstory was changed when we saw him in The Mandalorian, which already Disney couldn't keep their own canon straight. But getting rid of all of Star Wars canon from the expanded universe, and then later cherry picking that canon, taking characters, taking situations, things that they just chose to use, whether Dave Filoni wanted to do it or whether whoever wanted to do it. They've been doing that, and by doing so, they've both diminished the canon that Lucasfilm had created with their great literary works for the last 30 years, and also I find it inexplicable that not only did they render the books non-canon, but then they've gone back in and tried to make them canon again, but changed. That shows immediately how something that they did as soon as they took possession of the franchise, that they first laid down the law and then completely went back on what they were doing with the canon of Star Wars. Now, admittedly, this was canon that appeared in literary form and video game form and not necessarily on screen, but it was definitely considered canon by Lucasfilm that Disney later changed. I think the most egregious example of changing canon shows up in the final Skywalker saga film, The Rise of Skywalker. That would be Chief Palpatine's return. As we see in that film, the first thing we learn as we watch The Rise of Skywalker is the dead speak. The dead speak. Well, I guess we've seen Force ghosts speak and all of that, but they don't exactly broadcast their voices to the galaxy. In this case, we have Emperor Palpatine, who we saw definitively destroyed at the end of Return of the Jedi. He was thrown over railing by Darth Vader in the Imperial chambers. The Death Star exploded, and he was definitively dead. Ah, well, not according to J.J. Abrams and The Rise of Skywalker. They bring back Sheev Palpatine, inexplicably so. We don't know how he came back, where he came back from. I would say that that's one of the most not only egregious canon violations in any medium, but perhaps the most egregious canon violation in any motion picture ever made. Sure, having characters come back from the dead is a time-worn trope of science fiction, fantasy, and horror material, but let me just say that at least we get some kind of plausible explanation. But in this film, not so much. For a space fantasy like Star Wars, to strain credulity in this manner is something that I've never seen before. And it certainly was unearned. It's something that was beneath the franchise and even beneath a filmmaker that I hold in not very high esteem, like J.J. Abrams, who violated the Star Trek canon over and over again. So why it's surprising to see that he brings back Sheev Palpatine in Rise of Skywalker for no reason at all other than just to do it should not be surprising to anyone. Also, let me just point out that with the shoddy treatment that the Star Trek franchise was given, I don't quite understand why J.J. Abrams was seen as being the golden boy of the Star Wars franchise over at Disney, but be that as it may. So for my first evidentiary entrance into the record, I want to use not just the Legends stories, but Sheev Palpatine would be my first example of a canon violation in Disney Star Wars. And I don't know if my esteemed colleague is back.
Your colleague is having some technical issues. You have extra time, Mr. Burnett, and I know some people are going to accuse me of being biased in this trial. I'm no more or less biased in this trial than a Supreme Court justice who is biased. So there you go. We're even getting comments. We're live also on Rumble, I might add. You may continue with extra time. You have at least another 10 or 15 minutes, Mr. Burnett. I have watched you many times on live streams that have gone
all right then
countless hours. So it's unfortunate. This is why we have a prosecution team. Unless Mr. Ng would like to add, you do have extra time, Mr. Burnett.
Well, let's okay. Let's go on to talk about the actual. Let's talk about The Force Awakens for a minute. In The Force Awakens, we are supposed to believe at the end of Return of the Jedi, the galaxy has been liberated from the stranglehold of the Empire. The Emperor has been defeated. Vader has been defeated. And Luke has finally made the transition to becoming a full Jedi Knight. When we begin, if you're, say, 6 or 7 and you're watching Star Wars for the first time and your parents have taken you all the way through episodes 1 through 6 and you sit down to watch episode 7, what are you left with except as a 7 or 8-year-old dealing with the fact that your heroes that you followed, well, for 6 movies have been completely discredited and destroyed. Most specifically, the character of R2-D2. R2-D2 spends the entirety of The Force Awakens under a tarp, off in a corner, in the base of the now Resistance. I don't know what they're resisting. I don't know what incompetent boobs allowed the First Order to rise up and build a super weapon in striking distance within the heart of the Republic. I don't understand anything about the Millennium Falcon sitting on some lost world of Jakku, somehow being liberated from the possession of Han Solo. I don't understand any of that. None of that is necessarily a canon violation. It just makes little to no sense in any kind of storytelling capacity whatsoever. I don't even know why anybody would turn that in as a first draft script, much shoot it, and much less sit in an edit bay and say to themselves, oh, this is good. Now, of course, it made $2 billion, so what do I know? But what I would like to say also is that we have seen the ways of the Force in the first 6 Star Wars movies. Now we are presented with a character named Rey. We don't know who she really is. We don't know where she's from. We do know she can certainly know her way around a crashed Star Destroyer, which is fine. She's probably gone all through that because she's a scavenger and that's how she makes her living. However, we learned from Han Solo that traveling through hyperspace ain't like dusting crops. Well, I would say that Rey has not done much more than dust crops in the sand dunes of Jakku, and yet, the first time she's behind the throttle of the Millennium Falcon, she's able to pilot the Millennium Falcon better than Han Solo could, making maneuvers through the Star Destroyer as if she was born to it. And apparently she was, because she was born to everything. She was born to wielding a lightsaber. She was apparently born to be best pilot in the galaxy. She's also born to be the best desert scavenger. And I would say that one of the best things about the Star Wars franchise, especially the original trilogy, is the idea that the Force surrounds us and binds us. But you're not just tapped into it. You might be Force sensitive, yes, but in order to control the Force or use it to give you abilities, you have to study the Force. You have to train the Force, or with the Force. You have to be, it's not something that just shows up. And I would say that Rey, knowing how to pilot the Millennium Falcon, I don't know if you could say it breaks canon. It's just simply unbelievable. It's simply something that shatters the illusion of verisimilitude and shatters the idea of suspension of disbelief for an audience. How is it she's able to fly the Millennium Falcon? She's never been, I mean, first of all, it was hard enough for me to learn to drive a car when I'm sitting off center. But if you're sitting off center in a Carillion freighter, how are you supposed to be able to maneuver? I mean, that's got to be a tough job. We've never seen her behind the wheel of any kind of a ship, much less the Falcon, and a ship that's been souped up for speed and maneuverability. And yet she sits behind those controls as if born to it. This is not what Star Wars tells us. You might be born to something, but you have to work for it. You have to study it. You have to channel it. This is, I would say, ultimately a canon violation, because Rey is shown to be strong with the Force. But before she even knows she is, she's already performing miracles. I mean, even Jesus had to be 30 years old before he's turning water into wine. This is not something that happens normally. And for me, for this aging Star Wars fan, I found it quite offensive. It destroys the entire lessons of the first three films of the trilogy. I mean, it made me feel entitled, not unlike Gen Z is, to get everything they want, whenever they want it. And that's what Rey is. She's the perfect example of the modern age. Everybody's entitled to get whatever they want. Hey, if you want to fly a Carillion freighter, go right ahead. You're going to be great at it. If you want to, I don't know, wield a lightsaber, go ahead and do that too. You go ahead and you take on somebody who's been studying with the Force and who's powerful with the dark side. You can just wield a saber as well as he can. In fact, you can match him blow for blow in battle. This in itself is a violation of Star Wars canon. This takes everything we've learned from Yoda and tosses it aside. And this is only in the first film of the Disney trilogy. Who allowed this to pass? Who allowed anyone to tell this story? Well, you know, everybody at Disney did. From the executives on high to the marketing people who didn't have a problem with any of that. I don't know why. Writing a character that is perfect with no flaws goes against drama. It goes against everything we know about great storytelling. So I guess I would enter in Rey Palpatine herself as and by the way, speaking of canon violations, when exactly was Sheev Palpatine around? Who was Rey's mother? Do we know this? Who bedded down with Sheev to create Rey? Is she a clone? What is she? Do we know? I don't know. I don't remember hearing about it. But to me, is she an immaculate conception? Is she supposed to be Space Jesus? I don't know.
Jar Jar.
But these things are terrible. Maybe Jar Jar was the father. That would explain a lot. I mean, Jar Jar might be the unsung hero of Star Wars, or the evil villain. But anyway, Your Honor, that's what I have right now.
Joey Hamilton says, Mr. Burnett, one could argue Lucas himself bungled canon since the beginning. Why does secret baby Luke have the last name Skywalker? Why does Obi-Wan keep Kenobi? Why does Leia remember her mother?
I
Sure.
could rebut that, Your Honor.
Yes, let's, Mr. Burnett, if you could rebut that last comment.
That's just what George Lucas wrote. He doesn't have to explain everything. I mean, why does Leia remember her mother? She's force sensitive. She imprinted on her. She imprinted a memory on her that never left. That's why she has images of her mother in her memory. And as for people keeping their same names, well, if there's a bright center of the universe, Tatooine is the planet that it's furthest from. No one would ever believe that anybody would even look out there, unless, of course, you were a pod racer and you traveled to go to the Boonta Eve pod race all the time. Maybe you'd run into someone with the same name. But really, do pod racers run in the same circles as the Empire or Dark Lords of the Sith? I would say people just kept their own names because that's who they were. And there's nothing wrong with that. That's keeping your identity. And as we know, keeping your identity is oh so important these days.